Before we start, I just wanted to let you know that you can become a paid subscriber of Lecker on Substack, Patreon, or Apple Podcasts. And you'll get access to exclusive content to hear and read. Subscriptions really help support Lecker. So if you're in a position to do that and you'd like to, head to leckerpodcast.com/support to find out more. This is Lecker. I'm Lucy Dearlove. This month on the Lecker Book Club, National Dish by Anya von Bremzen. Conversations around food often, rightly, touch on attribution, ownership and identity, especially when it comes to certain dishes. But this subject is so complicated, and many dishes and foods that we consider to be deeply entrenched within a country's culinary history and culture are no more than PR exercises dreamed up a few decades ago. In National Dish, Around the World in Search of Food, History and the Meaning of Home, Anya von Bremzen explores whether we can find nationhood on a plate and what it says about us that we're so obsessed with looking for it there.
This book very much was about listening. It was searching for home, which is in the subtitle. Yes, to some extent for myself, but I wanted to see how other people perceived it.
I loved this book. It's fascinating and surprising, but also Anya is just such a great, dynamic writer that you feel like you're on the road with her. Party hopping at the Semana Santa in Seville, in the boardroom of an instant ramen company in Tokyo, learning to roll out the perfect pizza dough in Naples, drinking midday mezcal in Oaxaca. Anya and I spoke via video call a couple of weeks back, coincidentally on the day the book came out in the UK, and we talked about all of the above and much more when it comes to the thorny issue of the national dish. Anya, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. And I just want to say, first of all, how much I loved National Dish. It's such a great book. It's so interesting and I learnt so much from it, but it's also just incredibly fun. Like, it's a really enjoyable book to read, and I feel like I came out of it wanting to go on holiday with you, because I just feel like you must be a really enjoyable person to go and eat new things and travel to new places with. So first of all, thank you very much for writing it. And can I ask you, as a kind of starter question, what drew you to the idea of the national dish in the first place?
It's actually something that I've been thinking about for quite a while, because my career in food is quite accidental. I was a concert pianist, and then I had a hand injury. I was looking for something to do. I translated a cookbook from Italian, and I thought, I should write my own. And my ever first cookbook was called Please to the Table, subtitled, unfortunately, The Russian Cookbook, but in fact it was about the cuisines of the former Soviet Empire, all the different republics, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Georgia, which are all now independent countries. But as the book came out in 1990, the Soviet Union went bust. And these former republics of an empire became independent countries. And over the years, I literally watched in real time as they established their national canons, their national histories, and their national cuisines. So it just made me realize how recent some of this nation building is, and often how constructed. And I've been thinking about this ever since. And now, in the age of this intense globalization, what is a national cuisine? What is a national dish? On the one hand, the world is becoming more and more same. You can eat ramen, instant ramen in remote Andean or Mexican indigenous villages, or you can have sushi at any swishy place from Istanbul to Dubai to wherever. At the same time, as kind of the other side of the coin, our compulsion to tie food to place, to search out the local, the so-called authentic, is stronger than ever in response to this globalization. So I thought it would be a really good time to explore this through food, because food is a subject that tells us so much about so many things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that point about it being a particularly sort of pertinent thing at this particular moment is something that really struck me when reading it, because I think it really kind of sits so fascinatingly alongside conversations which are, particularly like really ongoing in the kind of British food media, but I think like elsewhere in the English speaking food media world. I couldn't speak to like any other medias, but the idea of kind of ownership, attribution, appropriation, and it's just everything is so blurred. So you think that it's because of this globalization that this kind of desire and need to attribute things, do you think that's the main reason for it, or do you have any other theories about why it might be the case at this particular moment in time?
I think nationalism has been around for a long time, as long as nations have been with us, and this kind of proprietary, patriotic feelings are stoked whenever a nation is in trouble, for instance, such as what's happening with the war in Ukraine, for example. So there are many reasons for that, and it's been around. It's just telling stories through food. It's actually quite recent. I mean, food has always been an important part of the narrative, but in the so-called food writing space, in the intellectual space, food used to be something, for ladies who write cookbooks, right? And now we have serious
right.
scholars and serious writers examining it to look at other phenomena. So because of the media, because of social media, because food is always with us on TikTok, on Instagram, we finally realize how many stories we can tell through food.
Yeah, totally. It's actually, I saw a TikTok the other day that really reminded me of this book, and it was somebody breaking down the idea of pad thai as a national dish and how that was invented as a marketing tool by the Thai government as well, which I had no idea about. So I feel like, you're right. There's just this kind of culture of storytelling in all these different forms, and that's really exciting, and it's a really good sort of moment to bring this to light.
To go back to your question about cultural appropriation, the reason is we're hearing about it so much is because we're finally paying attention to racial injustice, to power struggles, and again, food is such an interesting way, through an interesting lens through which to talk about it. But at this point, I feel that these phrases have been so overused that I feel that it would be maybe useful to talk about racial injustice directly, as opposed to saying, well, he appropriated my mofongo or my sushi or whatever. It's kind of almost becoming meaningless at this point. And I think the only thing that's going to really change the world, affect change, is political action.
Yeah.
Is political engagement. And I always joke if there was a donate button every time we use the word cultural appropriation, the phrase, it might have been more helpful. We really need to stay engaged, and we can't just kind of disassociate ourselves just because we use these trendy terms.
Yeah, totally. I think that's such a good point, because when you put it in kind of more blunt terms, we are talking about racial injustice, and I think people can pussyfoot around that issue a bit. So I think that's such a good point. How did you go about narrowing down which dishes to include in the book?
Well, that was quite difficult because, as you can imagine, every country has its own national dish. There's the aforementioned pad thai, there's feijoada, Brazil, and all these dishes tell important stories. I didn't want to be a total neophyte. I wanted to go back to places that I've researched before, that I visited, where I had contacts. And I also wanted to look at foods that are truly iconic and everyone can relate to. So pizza in Naples, natural choice. In Japan, ramen, something that everyone knows, everyone cooks from this packet, rehydrates, as well as rice, boiled rice, another cornerstone of Japanese diet. I wanted to look at tapas in Spain, because it's such an important way of not just eating, but socializing, small bites, little plates to share. They brought down the tyranny of the white tablecloth. Of the French.
Yeah.
I start in France because that's where an explicitly nationalistic discourse about food started. It's a culture that gave us terms like chef and gastronomy. It's where the restaurant was invented, believe it or not. It didn't exist in its current form in the 1760s. Sauces and the great self-importance and pomposity and the idea that food was something uniquely French. We had to examine this. And as my French dish, I chose pot à feu, which translates as pot on a fire and essentially is a boiled dinner. But it's really been consciously elevated to the status of a national dish. Then I go to Mexico, And I examine the corn maize tortilla and the female indigenous labor behind it, as well as mole, which is this complicated multi-ingredient stew that contains elements from Spain, from the old country, and as well as indigenous elements. And it kind of represents what the Mexicans call mestizaje, the fusion of these elements in national identity. And because I have a home in Istanbul, I look at meze, another important small plates tradition, and how that reflects the complicated multicultural Ottoman past, because Ottoman Empire dominated so much of the world. But it's been replaced in Turkey and other countries with nation states and a different definition of identity. And then I finally end in Ukraine with Ukrainian borscht.
It's such a journey around the world, really. I mean, that's kind of the subtitle of the book, but yeah, so many fascinating stories. I think one of the things that really struck me in the opening chapter in France, and this is a theme that I feel like comes up again and again in the book, it's almost like the tension between the myth and the romantic nature of this national dish, but then the reality of what people are eating and cooking. And I think it's like the French plat préféré is couscous. And there's almost like a similar tension in Japan with this kind of really elevated ritualized idea of Japanese meals and the kind of construct of rice and the dishes alongside it. And then the national reliance and obsession with convenience stores. And I just wondered if that tension, were you aware of that kind of, I don't even know if tension is the right word, but were you aware of those two things coexisting? And was that something you wanted to kind of look at in the book?
I was aware in part, but not to which extent it's actually the dominant reality.
Yeah.
In Japan, for instance, yes, I knew that people had globalized palates and they had access to everything, but I wasn't aware that when you talk to a Japanese person and you talk about McDonald's, which is Makdo, they tell you, oh, it's actually Japanese. I wasn't aware, for instance, how drastically declining the rice consumption is. So on the one hand, it's a cornerstone of washoku, this traditional Japanese meal that got UNESCO status and that Japanese are very proud of. On the other hand, no one wants to eat rice anymore. So, yeah, when you look, I hadn't looked at the hard statistics before I started researching this book, and the statistics are incredible. I mean, people are turning away from their traditional diets because, frankly, there's so much choice. In Japan, they're obsessed with bread, shokupan, right? As well as rice, as well as so many other things. We just have so much choice. And it's not always the old grandma dish that we turn to, even though we might be proud of it, and even though we might serve it for a holiday, and we have a sentimental, nostalgic attachment to it.
Yeah, I think nostalgia just is the thing that sort of always creeps into it. And yeah, I don't know how I feel about it in lots of ways, because I think, I mean, I'm English, so we have a complicated relationship with the idea of the national dish because our food culture is so, like, I guess fractured is maybe the word. And we have national dishes, but they are, in the example of maybe fish and chips and chicken tikka masala, they're the products of migration in themselves, which is, you know, really interesting in and of itself and maybe reflective of like what England and its other nations within the United Kingdom did in the past. But in terms of the food that I eat and cook at home, like, I don't think they have any relation to any idea of nationalism because, yeah, it is very globalized. In terms of what happened within the domestic sphere and then what happened within, I guess, outside of that, whether that's within restaurants or within kind of policy, do you think there's always a bit of a disconnect with those two environments in terms of how a nation views its cooking? Or it's eating?
It's hard to tell. I think you have to go nation by nation and moment by moment. The other thing that struck me as I was researching the book is how transactional, how shifting, and how fluid these things can be. So there are no yes or no answers to these complicated conceptual questions. Sometimes these patriotisms are heightened by situation, as we see in Ukraine with the war, for example.
Yeah.
Maybe the Ukrainians were craving sushi and ramen and pizza, but now they're all united behind borscht because it's a symbol of resistance for them. Identities as well are extremely transactional. I have this very funny scene in the Paris chapter about pot au feu where I go to a Moroccan butcher, a Maghrebi boucherie, in a multicultural neighborhood in Paris, and I ask for meats for a pot-au-feu. The guy, proudly just puts, the entire classic selection. And I'm saying, well, I actually want something different because it's from a 19th century cookbook. And these people who just before were talking in Berber and in Arabic and in broken French, and they were bashing Paris and saying like what a horrible place it was, they're all suddenly looking at me, all as, women in headscarves, Berber men. And they say, but madame, this is not a pot-au-feu. Do you know what French national patrimony is? And I'm like, oh my God, these people just like 2 minutes ago hated everything here. But now I offended them. I am the intruder. And they're defending French culinary patrimony. So there you go. I mean, who am I? Again, that Borscht episode really brought home my own sort of existential homelessness. Because I was someone from Moscow who speaks Russian, who thinks in Russian, but I am so opposed to what Putin has done, and I just so loathe everything about Russia. I don't want to have anything to do with that place anymore. I don't want to ever go back to Moscow.
Yeah, of course. At what point did you realise that the borscht, the epilogue where you consider the Ukrainian dish, at what point did you realise that was how the book had to end?
Unfortunately, at the point where the war started. Because as I was finishing a book, I had something else in mind. I wanted to make Thanksgiving, which is a classic American meal, in my very multicultural neighborhood where 160 languages are spoken. So I thought, wow, it would be cool to go and just interview all these people from different countries, what Thanksgiving means to them as an invented tradition. But unfortunately, then the war broke out and a huge pot of borscht sat in my fridge. It was made by my mom, and it kind of seemed very tragically where I had to end the book. I mean, it's like one chapter of the book I wish I didn't have to write.
Yeah, absolutely. But it is at the same time so important. Like, obviously, it's tragic that it has to be written. And I think that is another example of the constant shifting of the importance of, I guess, finding that solidarity and finding that nationhood in whatever form that might exist for you through food. I thought it was really moving.
Thank you.
To see in a situation that is still ongoing. Yeah, this idea of kind of constant evolution and shifting was so interesting, because that could look like something really huge, like, huge global event like the Russia-Ukraine war, or it could look like the Spanish government changing the legislation about how their Iberico pigs can be fed. Did you ever get a sense in the research and writing of this book, like where we might be going with this idea? Is there any sense of like what the national dish of the future might look like? Do you think we will have a completely different conception of what that means in, 20, 50 years? I realise this is a very difficult question, but I think the idea has changed so much in very recent times. I'd love to know if you ever got a sense of what it might look like.
I can only tell you what happened in the last 5-10 years, which is on the one hand the intensification of globalization and the erasure of borders and of national identities, because everything is so digitalized, and on the other hand the intensification of nationalism, because I think it's almost a natural reaction to protect what we think is our identity, to protect our roots. I mean, the populist dictators that unfortunately are on the rise, the Putins, the Bolsonaros, the Trumps are stoking these feelings. But I think whatever the dish of the future is going to be virtual. If we have a future at all, unfortunately, as this planet, we've just had the hottest summer on record. I mean, as I talk to you, we are almost 40 degrees, over 40 degrees here in New York in September.
Yeah, that was something that did strike me. I guess strikes me generally when it comes to food writing and thinking about it, that does it all seem a little bit futile in the idea of whether we'll even be able to eat a lot of the things that we currently eat in even 5 years. Did this book feel like an act of preservation in that sense? Was that something that was on your mind when you were writing it?
Not exactly. I think it's a chronicle of what people are saying. It's a snapshot of a moment now. Am I for or against nationalism? I mean, I came into this project as an extreme cosmopolitan who was very anti-nationalist, because precisely I was seeing all these populist dictators, all the ugly sides of nationalism. But I came out of it with respect, having listened to so many people with respect for people's idea of who they are, or whether I agree with them or not. This book very much was about listening. It was searching for home, which is in the subtitle. Yes, to some extent for myself, but I wanted to see how other people perceived it. Politics were changing. In Spain, for instance, this horrible, toxic populist party, Vox, was gaining more and more popularity. And they were literally about, bringing back the Catholic Reconquista and Isabella and Ferdinand and Inquisition. But now, recently, they lost seats. So these things are very fast. They move too fast for anyone to be able to predict anything. And the world is so unexpected. Who could have envisaged that we'll be locked down in a pandemic? And the pandemic also brought forth interesting things about nationalism. On one hand, you had this closed borders, you had vaccine nationalism, you had this is mine and this is yours. On the other hand, you had unprecedented international cooperation in creating vaccines. You had this stunning rise of digital commerce across the globe because you couldn't travel. So again, it goes both ways. And also you had this huge global trend of sourdough baking, right? So like the entire world was posting their mason jars of starters, bubbling away. It was like suddenly it's like everyone was eating the same thing. Or at least, the hipster contingent, right?
Yeah, a certain type of person who exists, I guess, all over the world was eating a certain type of thing. Yeah, that's really interesting, actually, because on a separate project, I've been looking at, sourdough bread, essentially, but the homogenization of certain types of sourdough bread, which I guess is sort of also relevant to this conversation because it's kind of an almost like conflict between people have this very specific idea about what a sourdough loaf looks like, and that is essentially, the kind of tartine, like San Francisco white loaf. But then you have the idea about, well, what flours, what wheats, what grains do you actually grow in your country? And moving forward, how can farmers grow what's good for them, that's good for the soil, what's good for us? So you kind of have this, it's a good example, I think, because there's this tension between what people want and what they see other people eating because of globalization and, being able to access anywhere in the world instantly. And then actually, the idea of place and geography. And I like the kind of mention of the European concept of terroir in the context of the Japanese sake producers. And I thought that was super interesting. And I didn't actually know that idea of terroir was European, because I guess I've seen it in so many other contexts.
No, it was the French articulated. They had the word. They first articulated this, since the 17th and 18th century. It's a very, not just European, it's a very French concept that's been adopted and borrowed everywhere. But it is interesting what you say, that kind of extreme locavore culture globally, in the end, is used to produce something that is instantly recognizable, whether it's a tartine loaf or a certain beer, right? Craft brew. But it's on the one hand very homogeneous and in another way very specific to place. It's a good point, yeah.
In some ways, without even realizing it, it's very specific to place because you have your own cultural understanding of something that, someone else might not have. So, it's so interesting.
Because of Instagram.
It really is.
Because of social media, right?
Yeah. Something else that occurred to me when I think it was particularly maybe it was actually in the Spain chapter, and I thought of it because I went to San Sebastian earlier in the year, and San Sebastian is, I think I had more recommendations from friends than anywhere else I'd ever been. Just as soon as I said I was going there, I just had people sending me like endless lists of Pincho bars and Michelin-starred restaurants, and it just become this real kind of touchstone for people who are interested in food, like going on holiday and eating there. And when I was there, I met a friend who has a restaurant there and has lived there for quite a long time now. And I just asked her, I was like, do the locals go to these places? Because when I was in there, it seemed to be almost entirely tourists. And she was like, yeah, not really, because they can't go there and have a relaxing drink anymore. And that sort of really struck me, this idea of almost the food culture is like a theme park. And I guess that sort of taps into the nostalgia element. But it's almost like at that point, are you preserving the culture or are you stagnating it? I was reminded of it when you talked about cooking the museum piece of a French meal. and just that idea of like, where does the line begin between preservation and then stagnation? I guess that's my point.
Oh, preservation and kind of shameless, rampant commercialism. And how does that preserve anything?
Right, exactly.
And does it preserve anything? Yeah, no, culinary tourism is a very interesting subject. And again, I don't have an answer. I think it's a little bit of both, because without the interest from abroad, a lot of these places maybe would have shut down.
Yeah.
But now that they are catering almost exclusively to foreigners, are they preserving something or are they changing it? Again, there's no good or bad. I mean, I'm not someone who essentializes culture and who says, well, it has to be this way, and I want to be in a place where, all the grandmas and grandpas are playing cards and having their, fish soup, whatever, because I think that idea is also it's a touristic idea, right? It's us imposing our own vision on the world, but I'm not sure what the correct answer is. I mean, just try to choose places that are less crowded. No, but I'm seeing it everywhere. Yeah. Europe is just, because of cheap flights, because of Airbnb, because of this like huge global conglomerates.
Yeah,
it's completely changing the face of cities.
Yeah, and you're obviously, you with living both in New York and Istanbul, I guess you see not both sides of the coin, but you kind of, like, Istanbul is a place that is, I mean, as New York is, but I think maybe in a slightly different way, Istanbul is a place there is so much tourism there, and it must be such a presence. Do you feel like you have not a unique perspective, but did that give you an insight that was useful in writing the book?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it helps to be from different places and to have different relations to places and have people to interview. But Istanbul, they've just finished a huge cruise port right near my house. And, sometimes you have 3 behemoth ships parked there a day, disgorging people looking for a quote-unquote authentic Turkish experience. And all the local entrepreneurs, happily obliging them and saying, yes, lady, come to my kebab place.
and who can blame them,
Obviously, no. You have to look at this way. I mean, for San Sebastian is a wealthy city, for places in Mexico and in so many other parts of the world, Africa, tourism is their only source of income. And can you blame them? And can you say it's a bad thing that they're actually earning a living, feeding semi-fake food to hungry travelers? There's just so many ethical equations here. But we should be thinking about it. I think my book is an invitation to consider these issues. I don't have easy answers. Nobody does. But I think, again, food represents so many different things. It's a portal into culture, history, economics, race relations, and so many other things.
Speaking of kind of the ethical consideration when it comes to this idea of the national dish, that was something that was particularly present in, as you just mentioned, in the Oaxacan chapter. And I was really struck by the idea of the labour ethics of indigenous female labour around the tortilla making, particularly in the context of kind of, there was an example you used where it was a chef from a restaurant in Mexico City coming and buying the tortillas and then selling them in the restaurant at a price that the person that had made the tortilla could never have afforded. And that just felt, there's something that felt so wrong about that, which is obviously a really obvious thing to say, but I guess there's an inevitability to it. I don't know.
It's on one hand wrong. I mean, it's not, he wasn't buying the tortillas, he was buying the corn itself. Because you make tortillas in place, and there's this lady who made tamales, and she was paid $20 a day to come and demonstrate in Mexico City. So on the one hand, there's injustice. On the other hand, the association with the celebrity chefs and with other celebrity chefs and the attention of like whiter Mexico, the whiter mestizo society to indigenous labor and to indigenous products, it's a good thing. Right, because without it, where would they be? And so again, it's a two-pronged issue.
Yeah, but then it was, I think, so illuminating to me to realize the kind of almost invisible labor that goes into these dishes. Whether that's factory-made ramen, instant ramen, or the production of nixtamalized maize for tortillas. Is that something you wanted to draw attention to as well?
Obviously, and the whole issue of gender, because when we talk about national canons, a lot of them originate from the 19th century and a lot of them is from men. I mean, think about French cuisine, like all these famous chefs, you know, the Escoffiers, the Carems, they kind of set out the canon. There was this famous gastronome called Kournonsky who traveled around France cataloging all the French dishes. And he traveled, I think, in a Bugatti or, you know, Rolls Royce with a driver.
Wow.
And so, yeah, naturally he included a lot of dishes with foie gras in them into the national canon. And only later comes the cuisine bourgeoise, which is from women.
Yeah.
In Italy, it's Pellegrino Artusi who writes the definitive national Italian book. Again, a rich white guy from the north, from the wealthy north. And his book basically almost ignores the south, the Mezzogiorno. So you have this kind of situation, but, you know, then later you have more attention being paid to women. But still, I mean, who are, especially in the global south, who are the people, you know, really going through the labor of making this food? And do acknowledge that labor? Besides just, you know, romanticizing, oh, here's this beautiful lady, you know, let's take a, you know, snapshot of her making whatever backbreaking dish she's making.
Yeah.
All these ethical considerations, race consideration, the indigenous labor, that I wanted to highlight just so the next time we eat something, not for us to feel guilty necessarily, although in many cases we should, but something to be aware of, because it makes food so much richer when it comes garnished with a narrative that tells us something important about the world.
Yeah, absolutely. In the kind of, I guess, the conversations you've had so far about the book, have you been surprised by any of the reactions to it? Have there been any reactions to it that, I guess you didn't anticipate when you were writing it?
No, I think some of these subjects are difficult. Some of the subjects are, not to say explosive, but, you know, who owns a culture, and what I, a white woman with all the privileges, writing about it. So I addressed it as much as I could, but I am who I am. I mean, I came to the United States as a refugee from a very difficult place, and this difficult place has become uglier since. So there's always a political story there. It's about cultural sensitivity, ultimately, and I think I was extremely aware of all these issues because as I was finishing the book and working on it, the whole racial thing exploded in the United States, all over the world. The pandemic happened, which exposed so many ugly things about us. So, yeah, one can't disassociate it from what we eat.
Lecker is hosted and produced by me, Lucy Dearlove. Thanks to my guest on this episode, Anya von Bremsen. National Dish is out now, published by What, an imprint of Pushkin Press. As part of the monthly Lecker Book Club, I'll be writing about the book over on the Lecker Substack and Patreon. And another reminder that you can sign up as a paid subscriber to support Lecker on Apple Podcasts, Patreon, and also now on Substack. Links are in the show notes. And to any paid subscribers who are listening here, thank you so much for your continued support. Music on this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.